I am Programme Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'm so pleased to welcome both our in-person audience and our online audience to this programme this evening. This is our last lecture for Archtober, an initiative held every October to promote the discovery of architecture and design. And you can find more information on this at archtober.org. With still over a week to go, there are many wonderful events taking place this month in New York City. This evening, we are very pleased to welcome you to the Scots Who Built New York, with John Kinnear, historian, preservation architect. The talk will examine the considerable impact of Scottish American architects, artisans and engineers on the development of New York from the 1700s until today. We are honoured to say that some of the Scottish figures John will be focusing on were active General Society members from the 18th and 19th centuries. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the art of the city, many of whom were artisans. Today, our 239-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our various educational programs. These include our library, of course, of which for in-person audience we are occupying this evening. The John M. Mossman Locke Museum, again the in-person audience are welcome to visit that after the talk this evening. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which of course tonight is part of. I want to thank Thomas Donahue, our window curator, for designing another wonderful window. This display embodies with humour and panache Scotland and New York City, and I definitely encourage you to have a look on your way out. It is on the west side towards 6th Avenue. I also want to acknowledge our partners in tonight's presentation, the New York Landmarks Conservancy and the American Scottish Foundation, and to welcome their members here this evening. Now, to say a few words about the American Scottish Foundation and to introduce our speaker, I am so delighted to welcome the President of the American Scottish Foundation, Camilla Hellman. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm so delighted that we're able to do another talk here around the Scots Who Built New York. We did so about 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, and it is a project that we began about 8 years ago in conjunction with Landmarks 50. They came to us and said, what did the Scots do towards the development of New York? And I turned to John Kinnear, who's on the board of the ASF and is also president of the American Friends of the Georgian Group, and said, John, what should we do about this? What do you know? We had no idea how deep it went. We've now given over 8 different lectures on it, and we have also done 3 walking tour maps with 2 others in development for the boroughs. And as we were doing all this, we realized the artisans were a key element of it. And so tonight, we're going to start to examine the great artisans. There are so many buildings, over 350, I think, maybe more that we've identified already, and we're really enjoying this. And so without more ado, I'd like to turn over to the very patient, very wonderful John Kinnear, who never knew what he was getting into.
Thank you. Good evening. It's so nice to see so many people here tonight. We'll probably jump right into this talk. But I did want to mention that we've had some people that, hearing about the talk, have gotten in touch with us about family members. We have Amy McMillan, who is a descendant of John McComb. We have Emily Fuller, who's a descendant of James Renwick Jr., and we also have people that have come to us. Oh, George Boyd, whose great-great-great-grandfather was the first president of the General Society. So I want to thank those people for coming forward. July 9th, 1776. The Declaration of Independence has just been read aloud for the first time in New York City. Captain Oliver Brown, a Scot, gathered together 40 of his men, and they came to the park at Battery City Park, and tore down the statue of George III. Art has meaning. They took the statue, broke it up into many, many pieces, and hauled it off to Litchfield, Connecticut, which is probably about 150 miles from where we are today. There it was melted down into 40,000 musket balls. Behind this house, this was General Oliver Walcott's house. Became a very important part of the Revolutionary War. And ironically, the people that have the house now are clients of mine. Federal Hall was the seat of the Congress, and it was where Washington was inaugurated, and it was designed by a French architect, actually, Lafont, who was a very influential person. We're going to be talking a lot about influencers, and they influenced the world, but they did it without having any social media. It's another view of that. Here's Lafont. He's the fellow who designed the Capitol, laid out Washington, D.C., and later he laid out capitals for many other countries around the world. Very influential person. Government House, this is the first major building by John McComb, and this was built to be the home for the President of the United States. What happened later, of course, is that the capital moved to Washington, D.C., so this became the house for the first 2 or 3 governors of New York State. John Witherspoon, the art of diplomacy, the art of statesmanship. He was a Scot who was involved in the wars, the Jacobean Wars, and eventually was captured there, taken prisoner, taken to Boone Castle in Scotland, where he literally tied sheets together, like in the old movies, and escaped over the walls, and eventually came to the United States. He was one of the founding fathers, very involved, one of the first signers of the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and worked on the Constitution. He was the only minister, the only religious person in the founding fathers. James Wilson, another founding father, very important. George Washington made him one of the first judges of the Supreme Court. Gilbert Stuart, the artist, again, a very influential person. Every one of our dollar bills has a Gilbert Stuart portrait on it. A few of his paintings. Lansdowne portrait was actually commissioned by an Englishman, and this portrait was in England until about the 1870s, when the National Museum, the National Art Gallery here in Washington purchased it. The Skater. This was painted when Gilbert was living in London, and was Lord Grant. Adam Smith, talk about an influencer. Modern economics as we know it today was pretty much his creation. He very much influenced Alexander Hamilton in putting together our government here as we know it today. Some of his writings. John McComb Jr., born in 1763. He and his father were architect builders here in the city before the Revolution, stayed in New York, and at the end of the Revolution were very, very important to the rebuilding of the city, which had no construction for about 10 years while it was occupied by the British. He won the competition to do City Hall with a French architect named Magan, It was educated at the Beaux-Arts School. And today, this is still our city hall. Some of the interiors are just beautiful. This is a picture during, contemporary to its being constructed. St. Mark's Church, still a very powerful, important part of the community, the downtown community. It was the site of Peter Stuyvesant's farm. Castle Clinton. This is Fort Clinton, which you can visit today. It's part of the National Park Service, and it has been restored to how it was as a fortress. McComb turned it into what we would call our first Madison Square Garden here in the city. It was a venue for entertainments. The Watson House. This is just across from where the Staten Island Ferry lands, and it was owned by a owner of many ships. The columns supposedly were made from his masts. Alexander Hamilton. There's a lot we have to say about Alexander Hamilton. Third son of the Hamilton family. His father immigrated to the Caribbean to make his fortune. He never made his fortune. Alexander, though, was a prodigy. He was a very super intelligent person, and that was recognized by the shipping company that he worked for, the trading company. They sent him to New York to go to college at what was King's College, which eventually became Columbia. And that was the start of his fortunes here in the city. Once the war started, General Washington met him, was so impressed, he put him on his band of men, his close cabinet, the people that wrote all his papers for him and helped run the war. This is his house, his country house, the Grange. This was designed, again, with McComb. Alexander Hamilton was somewhat what we'd call a gentleman architect today. The layout is extremely forward-thinking, let's say. It does not look like the standard Georgian house that was being built in this time period. And Alexander controlled everything in his life, including his house. Many houses, if you go to Gracie Mansion, there's a porch, a veranda that surrounds the house. Alexander, you had to go through the front door and be directed to the parlor or to the dining room. Then you might get out to the verandas. It was a very structured way to entertain. This is the house. The house was moved 3 times. Its location now in St. Nicholas Park is his last one. And actually, Camilla and I did a lot of work on the landscaping for the project. Hamilton also created the Coast Guard because he knew the trade. The country could not survive without people feeling they could trade with our country. So he had McComb build a series of lighthouses up and down the East Coast. And McComb is the only architect I've found in all my research in New York City that has 8 landmarks that are still standing, still existing. David Husak. David Husak was a great friend of Hamilton. He was a medical doctor, but he was also a botanist. If you've ever visited the Physic Gardens in London, where it's all medicinal, he brought that idea, that concept here to New York, as well as collecting plants from all over the world. We did a talk once about the Scots, who were the plant people that searched the whole world for plants that we'd never seen here before. David built this wonderful garden called the Elgin Botanic Garden, somewhat based on the gardens in Edinburgh. The gardens in Edinburgh were the first botanical gardens in the world. On the site today is Rockefeller Center. It's exactly the size of his gardens. Again, they were good friends, and Hamilton was also very into plants, and he and Husak got together, and this is a drawing we found of one of the gardens that Hamilton wanted for his house, and we were able to recreate it. There's a wonderful book by Victoria Johnson about Hossack and his gardens. William Forbes. Paul Revere, of course, was the silversmith for Boston. We had the Forbes family, 3 generations of silversmiths. Their silver still comes up for auction to this day. Influencers. Sir William Chambers, he's a Scot, but a very prominent architect in London and Scotland. And his buildings influenced a lot of what we see in Washington, D.C. and here in New York and other capitals around the country. Buckingham Palace, he worked on that. Sir Walter Scott, of course, writer, poet. We're not going to go into a lot of detail, but probably you all know a lot of his writings. Ivanhoe, Lady of the Lake. Anne Forbes, for her time, she was a very well-known Scottish portrait painter, an unusual profession for a woman in the day. This is a painting of her. William Marshall, he was a musician, composer, and author. He collected much of the Scottish music that we enjoy today, the dances, the reels, everything else. And he published it. He published it in books, and his music is still published to this day. So if you're in Scottish music, you've probably run across works from him. 19th century. Duncan Fife, furniture maker here in New York, cabinet maker. Premier cabinet maker. Here's some of his work is in the White House. This was his shop. You can also see quite a bit of his work at the American wing of the Met. Robert Adams, another great influencer, Scottish architect, 18th and early 19th century. His work influenced so much that's happened here in New York and in this country also. And he was also a furniture designer. Here are some of his pieces. Bruce James Talbot, a little bit later period, was sort of the mid-century. His work was sort of Gothic revival, which was getting to be very popular then. And he worked a lot with the Herder brothers. And if you've been to the armory here for the show or whatever, when you go in, if you go to the south room that was restored, that's Herder brothers' work, and it's magnificent. You really should take a look at it. Some of his furniture. Sir Henry Raeburn, sort of like the John Sargent of Scotland. His portraits are renowned to this day. And they just had a one-man show for him a little bit south of Edinburgh. The Reverend Robert Walker Skating, that's one of his most famous paintings, and it's the second skater we've seen tonight. A friend of mine here in New York is a collector of Raeburn, and he was at the show, of course. Canvas White, Benjamin Wright, engineers, responsible for the Erie Canal. The life-changing moment for New York City and for the rest of the United States. The canal connected the East Coast to the Great Lakes to the west, very responsible for all the settlements that took place out west. And it made New York, of course, the Empire City, and it became the Empire State because of this canal. It became the busiest port, eastern coast of the United States, and probably one of the busiest in the world. Water from the Atlantic being poured into Lake Erie. Davis Bates Douglas, Scottish engineer, here in New York. He also, besides what we're going to see now, he laid out Greenwood Cemetery, which was considered the first public park in New York City. He did the reservoir, which today is Bryant Park and the New York Public Library. These photographs, to me, show what New York City was like at the time. What we're looking at now would be the facade of the public library. It seemed like New Yorkers dressed pretty well then. Massey Ryan, a sculptor, his work is not only in New York, he was a sculptor pretty much worldwide, incredibly talented man. And I believe the General Society has some of his medallions here. Yeah. This is one of his busts. It's in the Brooklyn by the Arch. And here we have Peter Stuyvesant, moved from New York to Jersey City. I don't know why. And now we have Andrew Carnegie, who you probably know something about him. And he was the rags to riches, real life story. Came when he was about 14 or 15 to the United States. His family had to leave Scotland. Ended up in Pittsburgh. And incredibly intelligent person. I guess you'd call him a genius nowadays. He ended up working for the telegraph company. And he could deliver telegraphs from memory. He didn't have to carry any paper around. So if he'd run into someone in the street, he'd just tell them, "Oh, here's your telegram." And he was so impressed the head people of the railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, that at about 16, he's like the assistant to the president. And they so liked him, they wanted him to stay with them forever. And this is going back to Scotland. This is where he was born. And the house is open now, you can visit it. Anyway, the railroad people would put him on to things that they were going to be doing that would have a tremendous value in stocks. And they would actually give him money to buy stocks. And this was his first company, Adams Express. It was like the Railway Express or American Express today. And from this, it evolved into him getting involved in the iron industry first. And he was very involved in the Civil War. And he realized that iron wasn't really strong enough. So he went to England and he learned all about how to make steel. And he came back to this country and got involved in the steel industry. And he was, now he's got these steel mills. What's he going to do with all this steel? So he goes to cities, and a lot of cities, they need bridges across the rivers. And this is the one in St. Louis. So they'd say, well, we don't have any money to build a bridge. So he would go to Europe and sell bonds to get the bridges built. So he worked both sides of the equation. Did very well with it. The steel, of course, is it's everywhere. But here it is, the Brooklyn Bridge. Now, Louise Whitfield was his wife. They courted for 18 years. Finally got married and went on their honeymoon. They went over to Scotland and England. And on their way back, they met Walter Damrosch, who was a very famous conductor of the day. And he told them that he would never play. Nobody would come and play in New York. They couldn't get any of the good conductors or orchestras. And he said, because you don't have a hall. You don't have a proper place for us to play. So Carnegie said, no problem. We'll take care of that. And he came back and he bought this property, 57th Street. The rest of the city is down like 37th Street. Didn't bother him. So he built Carnegie Hall, and people will come. Now, to get from the city then to 57th Street was probably an hour and a half on a little carriage or horse or something. But it worked. It was sold out the first night. It's interior. Then, of course, now that he's married, he needs a proper house. So he buys this property on 91st Street and Fifth Avenue. He builds this beautiful house. He had a competition among a number of architects, mostly Scottish, of course. and had the house built. It was state-of-the-art for its era. You know, had elevators and electricity. This is, you know, very new in this city. In Carnegie, when he was growing up as a little kid, an uncle of his had a library and would let him borrow books from the library. So he was very much a self-taught person. He never went to college. He was self-taught. So in his whole life, he thought, I've got to give that chance to people here in New York City. So he got together with the Astors, had a private library, and got some other people together, and they put up the money, and they built the New York Public Library. And then he kept going, and in New York alone, he built 67 libraries. And I think 65 of them are still here and still being used as libraries or as community centers. There's a book that you can get. It's got all the libraries in New York. Throughout the country, he did about 2,500 libraries. He would give the city the money, then the city had to get the books, and then they had to also staff it. But they had a building. The General Society, where we're sitting, this library was a gift to Andrew Carnegie, and he also added a few stories to this building. So he's very, very influential to the General Society. Edinburgh Central Library. He did libraries all over the English-speaking world. He got involved in scientific projects also. He sponsored this ship that was sent up around the North Pole and everywhere to find out where the magnetic centers of the Earth really were, because it was very important for navigation. James Lennox of Lenox Hill. He was another great collector and had a huge library. His collection ended up being part of the original New York's Public Library. This was his house and library. It's now the site of the Frick Museum. John Steele, great sculptor. Sir Walter Scott in Central Park. Robert Burns in Central Park, and many, many other works. Scott. William Hamilton, son of Alexander Hamilton, made his life in the American West in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. He was a politician. He was just very much involved in that part of our country. Henry Wynne Young. He won a scholarship to the art school in Edinburgh and then ended up coming to the United States and becoming probably one of the best stained glass artists in the world. His stained glass is St. John the Divine, many churches here in town, the National Cathedral in Washington. It's just one small example of his work. Ralph Thomas Walker, Scottish architect. Also, we met the descendant of his family also. He did number 1 Wall Street, which was an office building until probably about 3 years ago, when it's been converted into a very high-end residential building right there at Wall Street and Broadway. James Renwick Jr., Scottish descent. St. Patrick's Cathedral, the castle at the Smithsonian Institute, the Renwick Building at the Smithsonian, and many other churches and buildings around the country. The State Capitol Building in Albany. This was Henry Hobbs Richardson was the architect for this. It's a massive, huge building. And in the interior is this incredible staircase done with Scottish stone and by Scottish artisans. There are 78 figures carved around this room in the staircase. It's really magnificent. If you're up in Albany, make sure to stop and see it. 20th and 21st century. William Tuttle, Scottish architect. Carnegie hired him to do his hall, his most important project up to that time in his life. Tuttle had never done a hall, but he went to Europe and he studied all the great halls, because everything is about acoustics. We didn't have any AV equipment back in those days, and he got it. He got it just right, and it's still considered one of the best halls anywhere in the world. John Duncan, another Scottish architect. This is Grand Army Plaza Arch in Brooklyn. Duncan also did Grant's Tomb, another must-see. If you haven't been there, take a look. The inside is incredible. It's one of the most magnificent interiors I've ever seen. And General Grant, of course, was a Scot. McComb, Mead, and White, premier architects of their era. Charles McComb, born in Pennsylvania, didn't really know what he wanted to do. Went to Harvard, met some people that said they were going to France, they were going to become architects. He said, well, maybe I'll do that too. He went to the Beaux-Arts school. In this era, there were no real schools of architecture in the United States at all. Everyone went to France. I had a friend, he was a historian in England. He came to New York for the first time. He said, John, you never told me New York, it's a French city. Because all our buildings are from that period, from that education. Now, of course, we have Penn Station, which, great loss. And as you know, it was what started the whole movement for landmarks laws here in New York, which are the strongest laws anywhere in the country. And so hopefully no more mistakes like this will happen. University Club, one of Charles's favorite projects. Incredible building. Looks like it's 3 stories, but it's really 7 stories, so it's a great engineering feat just to get everything into the one building. The interiors, again, are probably some of the most exquisite in the city. The library, modeled on the library at the Vatican. Just incredible. Columbia University, he laid out most of the buildings for the university, including the library. The Columbian Exposition, 1893. This was called the White City. They got the best architects of the time, all to come to Chicago and design buildings. And they built this magnificent city. Lakes, canals, a little bit of everything. This is the building that McComb, Mead, and White did, the agricultural building. If you go to Chicago now, there's one building that still remains. All the rest came down. Morgan Library, another one of Charles' projects. Still a building we love to visit to this day. John Russell Pope. He's the one that turned the Frick residence into the Frick Museum. This is the courtyard. This used to be an open courtyard. He enclosed it with this wonderful ceiling. Here it is from Fifth Avenue. They're just finishing up a major restoration of the building. It should be open early next year, I think, is what they're planning to have it open. William Lamb. His father was a carpenter, came to America. He became an architect and ended up being the architect for one of our most significant buildings in the city, the Empire State Building. All sorts of movies have been made around the building. He also was the architect for 40 Wall Street, which was the tallest building in the world for about 6 months. Yes? That's right. That's right. I just was reminded that Lamb and Rich designed the building we're in here today. The Chrysler Building was going up about the same time, and what they did is they built the spire inside the building and waited until 40 Wall was finished and raised it. And they became the tallest building in the world. But they only lasted about a year, because then the Empire State Building was finished, and that became the tallest building in the world for about 30, 40 years. He also did 500 Fifth Avenue, 521 Fifth Avenue. Had many buildings. Charles Rene McIntosh, another influencer, never been to the United States. Great architect, a little ahead of his time for Glasgow at the time. He and his friends, they called themselves the Immortals. They were artists. They weren't just architects. They were artists in many, many different ways. The Glasgow School of Art, probably his primary building, which is being restored for the second time right now. Hopefully it'll be done pretty soon. Willow Tea Rooms. He's also a furniture designer. And he also had 3 different shows in New York of his work, at the Met, at the Modern. So he's very influential to what we have today in this city. His furniture is well known. Eventually, he got frustrated with being an architect, that he was just a little too ahead of his time. So he went to France and spent most of the rest of his life as a painter. This is one of his paintings. This Mr. Gaudi here, he's a Macintosh historian, still very popular, still very active today. And Macintosh's designs also had a lot of influence on fabrics, fashion. There's a company in Scotland today called Tosh, and that's what they do, is fabrics, and so his name lives on. Frank Lloyd Wright, again, one of the most endearing architects in this country. And a lot of people don't know he spent the last 5 years of his life here in New York City, living at the Plaza. Redid one of the suites in his designs. There's one house in New York City. It's on Staten Island. It's still a private house. The Guggenheim, of course, is what brought him to New York. And he stayed. He never got to see it finished. It was pretty close, but he didn't make it he didn't see it this way. It's interior. It's a little house. This room is in the Metropolitan Museum of Arts. You can visit it. Philip Johnson. He and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe were responsible for the Seagram building, which is probably still to this day the most elegant skyscraper, maybe in the world. It was financed, of course, by the Profitmans. Philip Johnson did the Four Seasons restaurant. To this day, it's now called The Grill, but the interior is one of the few landmarked interiors in the entire city. So it still looks just like this. He also was involved in the last World's Fair we had. The State Pavilion has recently been restored also. New York State Theater, Lincoln Center. The last partner Philip had was Alan Ritchie, another Scot. He's still alive. And they worked together for probably the last 5 or 6 years of Philip's life. Some of the buildings that we see every day. Lipstick Building. There's a book out about Alan and Philip's projects together. Now I have Andy Scott, wonderful sculptor in Scotland, very influential. Here he is looking at his Macintosh sculpture, which is in Glasgow. Here it is complete. He also is very well known for the Kelpies, which are in Scotland on the canal system. Massive. You can see the size of them next to that person. Beautiful. They came to New York, slightly miniature version, but they were in Bryant Park for a while. Charles Renfro, contemporary architect, still in practice, of course, with his company. They're involved very much with the High Line. They're very involved with the last expansion of the Modern. Alice Tully Hall at Lincoln Center. John Jackson, he's an engineer that works in structural glass, and we've probably all seen the Apple Cube. That was one of his projects. And they did a lot of work, of course, with Apple and other places too. And he also did, you know, the tickets in Times Square? That was one of his projects also. This is Burns, he's a wonderful painter, Scottish painter. Interesting painting. The juxtapositions are very interesting. They're photographically realistic, but now we have a few actors and actresses. Sean Connery, of course, he had a place here in New York, and we all know everything that he's done, I would say. Not only just James Bond. Richard Madden, he's a contemporary, still practicing movies and television. Douglas James Herschel, Professor Nick Cutler, Irv McIntosh, quite a few movies. Naomi Scott, Sam Egan, The Outlanders. Well, thank you.
John?
Yes.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful overview of the contribution of Scottish Americans to New York City and indeed to the world. And interesting to see how strong a thumbprint they still have today in contemporary New York.
Definitely, definitely, yes.
Well, we'd like to take some questions now, both from our online audience and in person. Do we have any questions? Don't tell me that John told you everything you knew about Scottish Americans. Okay, we have someone at the back.
Can you share with us a little bit about how you got engaged with this? A thorough, in-depth lecture? I mean, it's fascinating. How did you get involved with this?
Well, Camilla and I have been friends for a long time, and we were on the Landmarks Alliance, which was formed when the Landmarks Commission was 50 years old. And they asked us if we could do something that made a connection of the Scots to New York. And we didn't really know where we were going with this idea. But, 10 talks later, and we got quite a grip on it now. But it's been a fascinating adventure.
Hold on. Could you hold on till the mic comes to you? And in fact, we have a gentleman here, and then I'll be up to the front.
John, thank you for the survey and the overview. I'm curious as to whether you would consider opining as whether the contributions of this litany of Scotsmen is distinct, out of scale, out of character, to other ethnicities in the early days of New York. Would you characterize this as particularly influential? And I guess as part of that question, is there a relationship between one generation of artists and artisans depicted here, and the next was the continuity of Scottish influence one that attracted others in its wake?
Well, I think what's most interesting, and certainly we found out, is the Scots have been coming to New York since the earliest days of New Amsterdam. The Scots and the Dutch were traders, 15th century, 14th century. So when the Scots set up New Amsterdam, which of course was a business proposition, this wasn't a colonization situation. They brought the Scots over. The Scots were, at that time, world famous warriors. So the Scots were brought over as traders, as merchants, and also they were the army that protected New Amsterdam. And then there always have been Scots in this country from that very beginning till now. They never came as a huge surge. You know, there was never that kind of a impact on the city all at one time. That's why there's no little Scotland, there's no, you know, they've always assimilated themselves into the New York fabric, basically. And from generation to generation, it's not necessarily always the same family, but a lot of families like the Forbes who were silversmiths for 3 generations, that alone, or the McCombs, it was the father, the son, and one of the McCombs was one of the wealthiest people in New York. He's a trader, a fur trader. So it's just they didn't come over here. In a way, Carnegie is one of the few people that had to come over out of absolute poverty. A lot of the Scots that came here were not poor people. They just wanted adventure. They wanted something new. That was kind of the impetus.
And John, one of the fascinating things was when the Erie Canal was being built, they ran into trouble. And it was the Scots that they turned to. Geddes, who was leading on the engineering, went back to Scotland and brought back the team.
Yes.
That then turned things around.
Correct, yeah.
Right, I just want to do an online question. Do you think there's any influence of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, intentionally or not, on Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well, that was something that we brought up. We did do a talk just on Mackintosh, right here. We did it here and a few years ago. And that was one of the parallels that I did talk about. It's almost like they're on the same wavelength, although they never met. And there wasn't that much exchange of publications between them. But their styles are very, very similar, no question.
And John, do you think, is there a book inside of you? Not to put pressure on you, of course, but it certainly sounds like you hit a vein of gold and it has to be further explored. And with what we heard tonight, I'm surprised there isn't a book.
What we'd like to do is to put a website together so that because we feel this is a legacy project. There's so much that we've collected now over the last 10 years, and we'd really like to make it more available to everybody, because I don't think anybody had any idea what there was. So we started on a book, but I really think we'd like to go even further.
Just about your process in assembling all of this information, where did you begin? When you said, I need to discover.
Well, I think the first talk we did, I thought I'd focus on Charles McComb, because he's obviously of Scottish descent and such an important part of New York between the 20th and 19th and 20th century. So we did a whole talk just on Charles McComb, which was very interesting. It did all that. And then it's just evolved in different directions, and it's been quite interesting. The last talk before this was the 5 boroughs. There's a lot of Scottish influence in all the boroughs.
And I think it's going to be wonderful that I love the idea that family members have stepped forward. It's so gratifying for both you and the families as well.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Is there any one of these artists or architects who you like that you would do another talk, like a more in-depth talk on?
Well, we've done John McComb as an individual. We've done John McComb, we've done, excuse me?
The modernists?
Yes, and we've done Charles Mackintosh and McComb, and we've done, Charles McComb. There's others, you know, almost any slide that I showed you tonight has a lecture behind it or a talk. You know, there's just so much. Yeah, this was like we said, it's like an overview just to give a feeling.
So in the 19th century and early 20th century, there were waves of people that immigrated to New York, and many of them faced all kinds of discrimination. So I wonder if the Scots did. But before I give up the mic, I do want to make a point that there is a Scottish architect named Alexander Greek Thompson who actually did more buildings in Glasgow than Mackintosh. And people have written that he was actually the architect that Frank Lloyd Wright looked to, you know, and there have been sort of books and articles about the similarity of Wright's work to Thompson's.
No, that's interesting. In fact, you know, if you want to send us an email or something, that's something we could consider also. These projects tend to have a tendency to grow, you know, as you get more information from different people. Yeah.
Discrimination, was there?
I can't say that, I don't think the Scots were ever in one group that could be discriminated against. They were spread out. You know, I mean, there are different places around the country where you have a little bit larger Scottish population. I know Columbus, Ohio, for some reason, has fairly large Scottish population. Glen Cove, Long Island's fairly Scottish. There's a Scottish population out by San Francisco, but never enough that would attract, you know, and I know what you're talking about with the Irish and the Italians and everything else, but I don't think they ever faced that kind of discrimination.
Approximately how many Scottish Americans are there? They say there's 40 million people of Irish descent. Do you have an idea of how many Scots Americans there are?
I don't really. I mean, it's probably not a huge number because, like I say, they've assimilated into the United States over such a long period of time.
It's amazing how many millions do say that they are Scots. So I think people do love the Scottish heritage.
Right, so I don't know the online audience to saying that. I think Camilla was making the point that many people are happy to claim Scottish heritage. I have a few more online questions. Can you talk about the Scottish influence in Cleveland? Stonecutters came from Scotland to work on the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, and that's from Gretchen Online.
Well, our focus tonight, of course, was New York, but I do know that there was a lot of Scottish influence in a lot of the other cities around the country. Absolutely. The fellow who taught me how to draft, you know, actual draft, was a Scot who came to the United States because he was working on the Capitol building for the expansion of the Capitol building. And he's the fellow that could draw an eagle so a sculpture could make an eagle that looked like his picture, that kind of thing. So I really appreciated that kind of training in my young days.
I believe that the White House stonemasons were Scottish.
I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were, yeah.
They've just been back in the last few years to do the repairs.
Yeah. That's what brought, like I say, the fellow who taught me how to draft, he worked for the stonemasons. There were the companies that did all the carving for the stonework in the United States. That's what brought him here. And then he just didn't go back.
Would you comment on the influence of religion on the Scots of New York City? Were there a mixture of Anglicans and Catholic?
Yeah, I think it was a mixture, quite honestly. I didn't find any focus in that sense.
Right.
I know in Denmark, in Copenhagen, there's a Scottish church that dates back to about 1710. Still there.
Right. Is there any part of New York City that reminds you of Edinburgh or another Scottish city or place?
It's hard to say. It depends, I guess, if you're in New York and where you are in New York. You know, I'd say like if you go into like Brooklyn or something, you know, it has beautiful little brownstones and townhouse areas. It can remind me a little bit of like the new town outside of Edinburgh, you know, that kind of thing where you get the Georgian architecture.
That's a very good answer.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even downtown, you know, you can get some, like around Washington Square, I can say, that has some of that feel to it.
And what about the statue of Robert Burns and Walter Scott in Central Park? Was that a reflection of these interests in those Scottish authors from New York City residents?
Oh, definitely, yeah, yeah, those statues are there, and there's that whole section of the park that has statues of famous writers and poets, and they're among them, of course, yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, I do see a couple. I'll just take these two more questions then, okay?
Sure.
Yes, thank you for enlightening us about the Scots men who were involved in influencing New York. And also, I learned a lot about New York City, which I didn't know before. And one thing that really intrigued me was the reservoir over Bryant Park. Mm-hmm. And then a few slides further on, you showed us a slide of the library.
Yes.
So what happened to the reservoir? Why was the water supply suddenly
What happened
somewhere else?
was 20 years later, they created Central Park, and the reservoir became the lake in Central Park. So they didn't need that reservoir anymore. And that's basically what happened. The water comes from the same place. It's that whole Croton system, from upstate New York, comes all the way down, ends up in the reservoirs at Central Park. And, for the last 30 years, they've been rebuilding the pipes that are miles underground, under Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens, to bring the water into the city. But that's what happened to the one where Bryant Park is.
Thank you for an exceptional talk. It was fascinating and connects us all to the buildings we see every day.
Thank you.
You noted the loss of Penn Station. In this very room, there was a talk from a group called the Rethink Penn Station Group, and apparently now, unless it's stopped and the resources are redirected, there will be a loss of many of the buildings south of 34th Street on the west side. So I don't know if there's any way the ASF group and the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen could perhaps mobilize to support the Rethink Penn Station efforts to preserve.
I know it's been talked about for at least 10 years or so, and I don't know if it's created enough momentum. Now, they did they did take the old post office and created the Amtrak station in that building. So at least that whole facade wasn't destroyed, because that was part of the whole Penn Station, the post office, everything. It was like a little miniature white city down at that part of New York City. And I'm glad they didn't just knock that down, the old post office.
I also want to mention that our partners, the New York Landmarks Conservancy, are advocating very hard against those buildings go down. And if you go to their website and sign up, you will get emails corresponding to that. And we also had a recent lecture on the why those buildings shouldn't be torn down, because basically the purpose of the lecture and the group who gave it was through running trains, sending the trains further on than Penn Station and other stations in New York City.
And Rethink Penn Station and Sam Turvey, if you Google that, John, to your point, have they been mobilized? Sam Turvey would say absolutely without a doubt, and he's certainly a force to be reckoned with. He's very convincing, I have to say. So, pass that. Yeah.
So Rethink NYC for anyone who wants to find out more information about that. We are going to conclude now, but I did have just one final remark from one of our online audiences. They applaud you for highlighting the many Carnegie buildings, but they ask about the Carnegie Tech.
Carnegie Tech, yes, it's in Pittsburgh, and it wasn't part of this talk only because we talked about it before. We have a whole talk that's just Andrew Carnegie, and it takes in all of his projects all around the world, quite honestly. But Yeah, it wasn't left out by mistake. It just wasn't part of New York.
Of course, that explains that. So absolutely. So John, I just want to express our appreciation to you again for really a wonderful, enlightening talk. So thank you so very much.
You're welcome. I'm glad everyone enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we absolutely appreciate your extensive research, so thank you very much. So now to say a few words is Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director, and Camilla, I don't know if you would also like to say a few words in conclusion? Is that a yes? Oh.
So, John, thank you so much, I mean, for the way you assembled all this wonderful information. And I have to tell you, for all of our attendees who are regularly here, you know, one of the things we focus on in the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen and our lecture series are triumphs and accomplishments and everything that's been done. My father used to say to me, and I remember in grammar school, these lessons came early. My father was the 1982 president. His picture is upstairs, my mother's picture as well. My father was very big on telling me I was born rich, and it really stayed with me. And it's really an approach to life. I'm a native New Yorker. You know, he told me these roads are here, these bridges, these museums, this water that comes to you, everything that has been there for you, you're born rich, and it's your turn to do something. And I think that accountability, that responsibility, even when you're a child, it really stays with you, and it's an attitude to life. We're very rich, and I'd like, you know, I think about it a lot and concentrating on the triumphs of all that's been created. And I know it was there was a lot of men talk, that's okay, as I always say, and we lived happily ever after, it's all fine, because we concentrated on all of these people who gave us so much. Carnegie, I just want to say, if not for him in 1903 to give the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen $250,000, that was well spent, because this library, I think about it every day, I've said that before, how he had the foresight to give us that money, and then we were able to put 2 floors on top of the building. I do want to say Lamb and Rich was the first campaign of the building. The second that Townsend did was the library and the 2 floors on top. And hearing everyone and seeing all of their accomplishments, they've left so much behind, and it's really important for us, for a civilization to continue to feel, again, that responsibility of transmission, creation, production, and yeah, it's
Well, I
can't
always
say enough
like to
about
say
it.
too,
So
history
thank
isn't
you.
told. History isn't told. We live history every day.
We do.
And yes, it's up to us to continue the things that make sense and are very important.
And if you don't want to look back, you will have a hollow life, because you'll just never feel the things that are around you. So as I sat here, I just really was thinking, you know, more of an affirmation for that. So thank you so much for feeding our souls. Thank you.
Thank you for being such a wonderful host, Victoria, and all of that you've done to help us to put this together. When we do projects like this, they take a huge amount of energy from John, from our staff who put this together, and this is wonderful to have this response, because we really believe in this project, and I think it's very important that we don't lose this wonderful research that's been done that gives such a connection to the Scottish American community, to New York and beyond. And so thank you so much for being so responsive to everything we're doing. Thank you.
And as we conclude this season, we may have one more lecture. I just want to say, you know, Karen, thank you for producing these lectures and for all of your wonderful hard work. Thank you.
Yes.
Or behind the scenes stuff.
Right, of course, to Meg Stanton and Angelo Vigorito. And Angelo also doubles as our archivist, if you could believe this, and he's our technical director. Thank goodness for his electrical engineering background. That comes in handy in his production background. And to Thomas Donahue, again, our wonderful curated windows. Thank you, Thomas. You are so, we love you. Thank you. Thank you for all of your attention. And to our volunteers, Arlene Fingerman, Mary Brogan, and Nancy Broderick, and and Jimmy, of course, and to our audience, thank you for coming out at night. That never leaves us either, that you make the time to be here and share these evenings with us. It really is a blessing to have you in person, so thank you to each and every one of you, and to our devoted online audience as well. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you.
Finally, in conclusion, we would like to present you with a little memento, John, the poster of tonight's talk. This, as Victoria mentioned, yes. As Victoria mentioned, this is going to be our last lecture for a little while. We will hopefully have a lecture on patents with Tom Rinaldi in early December. In the meantime, I want to express our appreciation to you again for your support, and to our online audience, and of course to our wonderful speakers and our in-person audience, courtesy of the American Scottish Foundation. Please join us from some delicious snacks and a glass of wine. And I'm sorry our online audience can't be here, but there you go. Anyway, good night. Thank you very much.